Hello. What we're going to be talking about today is the economic impact analysis of the Ports Future project. This was one might say, the economic component of a much larger project. And the authors here are Vlad Pascal, who's going to be talking to you in just a second, myself, Roy Boyd, and Ani Ruhil. And we're all associated with the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs here at Ohio University. So how this analysis will proceed is, first of all, I'm going to go through some of the basic introductory remarks, and then we're going to get into the details of the actual modeling scheme, which is something called IMPLAN, and Vlad will fill you in on the details of that. And so there was a series of public meetings in which the community was invited to participate, and they gave their input into the analysis. And then future use scenarios were developed really in conjunction as a combination of community members and the visioning teams, and they were voted on by the public at large, and then that's what we decided to discuss in this particular economic analysis. Now, the purpose of these estimates, we're going to be using some software to look at various plans and how they relate to jobs in the area, because this, of course, is a fairly economically depressed region. Jobs are of a lot of importance here, as they are everywhere, and labor income and value added. Now, value added we'll be talking about a little bit later, but that is going to be something that includes labor income as a subset. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to provide the public with a very meaningful basis for expressing preferences when we compare a number of scenarios, and we're going to be listing those scenarios. Okay. Now, here are the basic scenarios that we have, and these are ranked as the community ranked them. So that's not necessarily the ranking we're going to have when we talk about jobs or value added or labor, but this is the ones that through voting preferences the community ranked, and so these are the ones that we're going to look at. And the first one is to use this site as a nuclear power plant, okay, to provide power for this particular region. Next, in a variation of this, okay, is to provide what we call green energy production. In other words, to be using new technologies and provide energy. And this energy can come in various forms, electricity being one of them, to service this region. Okay. Another idea would be to have an industrial park. The industrial park would produce a number of goods, and these would be for the benefit of the community and definitely for the benefit of the larger area, and definitely the benefit of the community as far as jobs and things like that go. National research and development, in other words, a national laboratory. This is one of the things that was thought of. Warehousing, distribution, and transportation hub. Now, this would be something perhaps similar to in Columbus, you have the Rickenbacker facility, something where this area would act as a hub where transportation would come together, whether that be air, road, rail transportation. And you're not that far actually from the river, so you might be able to use some water transportation as well. And this would be a hub where things could be stored and transported. One of the nice things about Ohio is that this region is perhaps within 400 miles, you get into about 80% of the population of the country. And so this was thought to be an interesting use. Training and education. This is always something that people think about when they think about jobs, and trying to get the skill level of the community to raise that into the types of jobs that might be higher paying. And so that was another possible use. Metal recovery. This was looking at the fact that in that diffusion plant itself, as well as other areas, adjacent areas, you have quite a bit of raw metals, and you could try to recover those and use those as recycled metals and turn a profit on the whole thing. And then a multi-use Southern Ohio Education Center. This would be combining some of the ones up above, as would the green belt, the last one that we talked about. Okay, so now what we're going to do is talk about calculating then the impact estimates. And what I'm going to be going over is perhaps a short and dirty version, but a much more intuitive version. And then Vlad will get down into the details. And so let me start out here. There are several impacts. The first impact that you have when you have any new facility that is generated which is something called a direct impact. And a direct impact is when you have a new business itself. The new business opens up. This is a direct impact. You have people employed. Capital is used. So jobs are generated and resources are generated, some of which actually goes to the government in the form of taxes. So these are all what one would call the direct impact. And that's what most people are familiar with when they think of a new facility going up, is the direct impact of that facility itself. However, the economy is very much interrelated. There are a lot of linkages within an economy, and to say that the direct impact will exist as some sort of an isolated impact is incorrect, okay? Because we have additional impacts, okay? You have, first of all, when you get when you get that new business, the goods and services from other businesses will be impacted, okay? For example, if you were to have let's say something that produced energy, then obviously you are going to need some raw materials from other industries, and you're going to be providing energy to other businesses. So there's both the inputs and the outputs of this facility are going to impact other businesses, and they're going to have a positive impact, okay? Depending, of course, on how strongly these linkages exist within the economy. And we find that in the manufacturing sector, these linkages could be fairly high. If you've got something that is manufacturing a product, it's going to be using inputs from other manufacturing plants and services, and that its outputs are going to be affecting other manufacturing. So you have other businesses, and what you also find is that there is going to be increased household spending. Once you have jobs, once you have new jobs available, and actually to some extent capital available in the area, but definitely jobs and new income in that area, then the people that receive that are going to be using that money, spending it on other items that in turn are going to influence the economy at large, and in particular going to increase the ability of other folks to produce goods and services. Okay, and that combined will give us a total economic activity, which are to be looking at jobs, wages, and one thing that I mentioned before, you're going to have an increase in tax revenue, because all of these are going to be taxed both at the at the local, state, and federal level, and to some extent you're going to have that some of that stuff go to the federal government. Okay. Now, I'll just give you a quick background on here on what we use. We use something called IMPLAN, and this is a self-contained modeling package, and that includes all the needed data. It's done yearly, and it's developed by the MIG Systems. IMPLAN is a very standard sort of model. It's been used in a lot of analyses like this. Here at the Voinovich Center, we have IMPLAN data for the state of Ohio, and we also have, and we have it county by county within Ohio. We also have a national database here at Voinovich. For this particular analysis, we could use a combination of those sorts of things. Sometimes we would use county by county data, individual counties. We could also use regional data and statewide data. So this gave us a lot of flexibility to look at both the local and the statewide effects. We could also look at national effects, but we concentrated on the statewide effects. And so now I'm going to get more into the detail of IMPLAN. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Vlad Pascal.
Sure. As Roy just mentioned, we used IMPLAN. IMPLAN is an economic modeling system, and we use it to quantify some of these impacts. It's a well-known package, and as you can see, IMPLAN is extensively being used by many different agencies, by government, academic institutions, private and public companies, and it uses the data from many of the publicly available data sources. And you can see the example. It's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Bureau of Economic Analysis, Census Bureau, Department of Agriculture. Again, IMPLAN is a very well-known modeling system, used a lot, using some of these publicly available data sets. So in a sense, when we model this impacts, what it allows us to do is to create a snapshot of the economy, creating a really true picture of the local economy, and then we can quantify these impacts, run them from the model, and estimate the economic impacts. So what are some of the components of the IMPLAN model? Well, as you will see it in a minute, one of them is a labor income, and essentially it's a wages, salaries, and any payments received by self-employed individuals. But it also includes what we call is value added. And value added, you can think of it as economic contribution of the particular industry or a business. And it typically includes labor income, so it includes wages and salaries, and it also includes profits, any payments, and indirect business taxes. So those are three major categories that we'll use when we talk about economic impact analysis. Conceptually, we divided, when we model those impacts, we divided them into two big categories. Operational impacts, or impacts when all these individual 9 scenarios will be fully operational, when they will be fully completed, and so-called construction impacts, because some of them will need time to build, to construct, so conceptually it makes sense to divide those two activities into these two categories. One important thing is when we presented those results to the public, we only use operational impacts. Okay, so all the voting was done using only the operational impacts. As Roy mentioned, there are 9 different scenarios, and they're really diverse. They're very different from each other. They include different components and different options. So the first thing what we had to do is to translate those impacts into sort of numbers, because you can't just put the nuclear impact and try to run it. You need to have some numbers for that. And our job as analysts were to convert these impacts into sets of numbers. So what we've done is we conducted an extensive research trying to quantify those scenarios. So for example, we look at the data from the Department of Energy, we look at the data from Census Bureau, we look at the examples that were done by other research institutions, did some literature review looking at the examples in different trade publications, and actually look at some examples from actual companies that implemented these scenarios. Once we quantified each of the scenarios, we run we run those scenarios through InPlan. We estimated number of jobs, we estimated income, we estimated taxes, put this together and present it to the public. One important thing to mention is that impact represent a conservative estimate because we don't want to be over optimistic, so we have to be as analysts very cautious. And as you will see, our impacts present a lower estimate of this impact results. And again, they exclude impacts of a construction. Operational impacts do not include constructional impacts. So let's take a look at some of these results. So here are some of the results of those economic impact estimates. Let's look at each of the scenarios individually. Let's start with education center. As you can see, the picture on the right tells you what this particular component includes. So in this particular case, education scenario will include a little bit of the industry. There's a light industry. There's a little bit of the research and development. There's educational component, but there is also stuff related to education and nonprofit offices, things related to the museum, earthworks, and the green spaces. So they're very diverse, as you can see that. And the table below shows some of the economic impacts associated with that particular scenario. In this case, we estimate that the direct impact on this educational center will be 275 jobs, over $10 million in labor income. Remember, labor income is wages and salaries, essentially. And in terms of value added, it's going to be over $13 million. Again, this is direct impacts. But when we consider additional impacts, those indirect impacts due to increased household spending, due to increased purchase of goods and services in the area, the impact is going to be much larger. And you see that when we combine direct and induced effect, the true economic activity is much larger. Let's look at the total effects. So for example, in terms of employment, the true economic impact will be over 360 jobs, about $300.3 million in labor income, it's almost $18.5 million in value added. Again, as you see, the economic impacts goes beyond the just direct effects. We should consider those additional impacts. Greenbelt is another scenario that was selected by the community. Again, it's very diverse. It includes very different subcomponents. One of them is a heavy industry cleaning. There is an emphasis on the green research and development in the green energy. But other components tend to be very similar. So for us, it was a little easier to model it. Again, in terms of economic impacts, you see it's much larger as opposed to educational center. Again, it goes back to those linkages existing between different industries that Roy mentioned. So in terms of direct impacts, we have employment, almost 900 jobs. It's 884 different jobs, over 39 million in labor income, and about 49 million in value added. Again, when we consider additional impacts, the economic activity is going to be much larger. So in terms of jobs, we have almost 1,200 jobs, labor income over $50 million in labor income, and in value added, it's almost $68.7 million in value added. Metal recovery, the emphasis of this particular scenario is on the recovery of the metal because there is a lot of metal at the facility which can be recovered. So in terms of economic activity, the total effect is over 1,000 jobs. The labor income is going to be over 45 million jobs, and the value added slightly over $60 million in value added. Again, you see it varies a lot between all these different scenarios. Nuclear power plant is the next future use scenario option. In a sense, it's a little simpler for us to model because it includes only one component, nuclear power plant. So in terms of economic impact, the total effect will be over 840 jobs. Labor income will be over $51 million, and the value added over $145 million in value added. Again, it's a very different scenario, but the impacts are generally somewhat larger if we compare it to educational center because of the linkages between different sectors. The warehousing component, it's a hub. It's a multimodal hub that includes warehousing component and a commercial distribution and storage component. Very similar to what Rickenbacker Airport here in Columbus, Ohio. So conceptually, in terms of employment, direct effect is over 500 jobs, labor income over 23 point almost $5 million, and the value added over $33 million. Again, when we consider additional impact, indirect effects, and induced effects, the total economic activity comes to over 771 jobs, $33.3 million in labor income, and $46.6 million in value added. Green energy production. As the name suggests, the emphasis of this particular scenario is on the production of green energy. Okay? But it also includes different components related to health and wellness, components related to the green areas for the future use, and the sort of entertainment component as well. Impacts are also different. Notice that, for example, here a different direct effect comes to 861 jobs, and labor income almost $49.7 million, and value added almost $113 million. When we consider additional impacts, it's going to be much larger. The total effect in terms of employment comes to 1,400 jobs, labor income $71 million, and value added over almost $149 million in value added. Industrial park includes various components. You can see there is a heavy manufacturing component, there is a post-consumer recycling component, there is things related to green and renewable energy manufacturing, research and development. It's a very diverse sort of component which includes many different activities. Again, effects tend to be sort of very high if we look at the total effect in terms of employment. So you can see it's almost 1,275 jobs in terms of employment, 65.7 million in value added, and $142 million in value added. National Research and Development Center, emphasis here on the research and development of the different components. Again, when we model it, we try to look at some of the examples that we have. For example, we look at some of the national labs. And in terms of impacts, it's one of the highest. You can see that actually direct effect here is about 1,500 jobs in terms of employment. The labor income tends to be also very high, almost 71.6 million in labor income, and the value added is about $86.3 million. Again, when we consider additional impacts, the impacts is going to be even bigger. Total effect comes to over 2,000 jobs in terms of employment. $89.7 million in value in labor income, and almost $18.7 million in value added. Very high numbers because, again, the linkages tends to be very high. There's a very labor-intensive project scenario, so that's why the impacts will be much higher. Training and educational component, as the name suggests, the emphasis here on education and the training part. Impacts tends to be a little lower when we compare it to some of the other future use scenarios. So in terms of employment, the total effect comes to 245 jobs. Labor income slightly over $5.1 million, and the value added almost $6.8 million in value added. So this is just a description of the operational impacts of these 9 of these scenarios. But we also look at the construction impacts, because construction is an important part when we have to implement those scenarios. Again, what we had to do is to translate some of these impacts into a set of numbers. And again, it was done for different extensive research. And essentially what we did, we first had to determine the most likely type of the building. In this case, we had to consider whether it's going to be office, or warehouse, or plant. And then we have to determine the size of that particular facility for each scenario. So remember that each scenario includes different components. So we had to do it for each subcomponents, for each activity in the individual scenario. Again, we use the data from some of the publicly available data sources, Census Bureau, Department of Energy. We look at the trade publications, some of the actual examples from their real life, trying in order to estimate and to quantify some of these impacts. One exception to that was the nuclear energy, because nuclear energy tend to be a little different in terms of construction. When it comes to construction from any other scenarios, we had to quantify it a little differently. But General approach was the same. Basically, for each of the scenarios, again, we're talking about the construction impacts, we included the costs associated with the support infrastructure, so we look at the roads, landscaping, things like that. We also look at the utilities, site development costs. All this was included in the construction cost. And for the most scenarios, we had to assume some kind of construction period. And again, just to simplify, to keep things simple, we used a 3-year construction period for each scenario. We also applied what is called local purchase percentage. In INPLAN, it means that because certain commodities, certain things will be purchased outside of the region, we don't know which of them. That's why we have to rely on the INPLAN to tell us what's the percentage, what percentage of those commodities was purchased locally. And we had to apply that in order to estimate the economic impacts associated with the construction. Again, we included engineering and architectural fees. They are part of the cost. Now we can look at some of the results of the constructions. So our first example in this is a warehousing, distribution, and transportation hub. You see the impacts of the construction, and again, those impacts are for the 4-county region, and the impacts are based on the estimated direct construction expenditures that occur in the 4-county region. One thing we have to remember that those are annual impacts, so they will occur for each year in which construction sort of continues. So if it's a 3-year, we can expect those construction impacts to continue for 3 years. So if we look at the employment, we see that during construction, the total impact in terms of employment will be almost, well, it's going to be 134 jobs, $5.8 million in labor income, and about $7.5 million in value added. National Research and Development Complex. Again, impact is going to be here a little bigger. So total effect in terms of employment will be 226 jobs, almost $9.8 million in labor income, and $12.8 million in value added. Nuclear power plant. Again, as I mentioned, it was a little different with the way we had to quantify it. So impacts tend to be generally very high during the construction phase. If we look at the employment, the total effect, including direct and induced effects, is almost 3,900 jobs. Labor income is going to be very high. You see it's almost $167.8 million in value added in labor income, and the value added obviously also going to be very high, $220.7 million in value added. Again, tend to be very high because of the nature of that particular scenario. Very labor intensive, takes a lot of labor to complete this particular scenario. On the other hand, training and education scenario, here the impacts tend to be a little lower. Again, it has to do with the type of the construction that will be at that facility. It will be offices, and the infrastructure will be a little different as opposed to, for example, a nuclear power plant. That's why impact is going to be lower. So in terms of employment, 32 jobs. Labor income will be $1.4 million, and the value added will be $1.8 million. Multi-use scenario, again, in terms of infrastructure and the construction, tend to be very similar to the previous scenario. Employment will be 40 jobs, $1.7 million in labor income, and a $2.3 million in value added. Again, it has to do with the type of the construction, types of offices, infrastructure, and things like that. For the Greenbelt, we have total economic activity in terms of employment, 127 jobs. Labor income will be over $5.5 million. And the value added will be $7.2 million in value added. Metal recovery. So you can see that in terms of employment, 119 jobs, labor income, 5.2 million jobs, and the value added, $5.7 million in value added. Industrial park, total economic activity comes to about 92 jobs, labor income slightly over $4 million, and the value added will be $5.2 million in value added. Green energy production. Impacts in this particular case will be much higher. because it's a different types of construction, different types of offices, different types of buildings. Notice the total effect in terms of employment. It's over 1,900 jobs in employment. Labor income will also be very high, $83 million in wages and salaries. Okay, value added is also going to be high. It's $109 million in value added. So the numbers will be much higher due to the nature of that particular scenario. It requires more infrastructure, different types of buildings. That's why the impact is going to be larger. So here, the summary of the operational impacts. Again, public was presented with the operational impacts. Construction impacts were not included in the voting. So if we rank them based on the value added, you see the green energy productions tend to have one of the largest value added components. It's slightly over $140 million. It's closely followed by the nuclear power, which has also had a very high value added component, and the industrial park. Those are the three big components in terms of value added if we rank them. One of the lowest tends to be training and educational center, and you see it's actually both two of the components, educational center and training and educational components. They are on the tend to have very low value added component. Again, it has to do with the nature of that particular scenario, what kind of activities included in this particular scenario, and the direct connection between industries. So as you saw, all these 9 scenarios include very wide range of activities. They're very different from each other. So economic results and economic impacts obviously vary considerably, in part due to direct inputs, the way we quantify those scenarios, and in part it has to do with the structure of the economy, those connections and linkages between different sectors. So we have to be very cautious when we're interpreting these results. Our job was to make sure we present fair and unbiased results, but nevertheless we have to be and the public in general has to be very careful when we're interpreting these results. So what happened? When all these economic impacts results were, together with the description of the scenarios, were presented to the public opinion from residents about preferred scenarios for the future was gathered, and you can see that we had over 1.6 media impressions that was delivered from multiple channels. We reached thousands of different people, and what we found that nuclear power plant and green energy production together with industrial park tend to be top 3 preferred options for this particular task. Again, they tend to be very different. They encompass a wide variety of different activities, but those 3 tend to be in the top.